Namaste, Jai Shri Ram, and welcome to Citti Media. We live in topsy-turvy times, and there are a lot of strange things happening. So we decided to invite two very knowledgeable experts who are going to help us understand some of the things that are going on. So we have Pandit Satish Sharma, who is a civilizational analyst and a British Hindu scholar, and Abhijit Iyer Mitra, who is a geopolitics expert, and I would say also someone who has a very fine and witty and intelligent sense of humor. So it's going to be a great conversation. Namaste and welcome to both of you.
Pranam ji, namaskar, Jai Shri Ram, Navita ji, a pleasure to be here. And Abhijit ji, so delighted to be in the same space with yourself. It's long overdue. I'm looking forward
pleasure's all mine,
to really enjoying it.
Thanks for having me on, Navita.
Well, welcome. So let's start off. We have a war going on in Ukraine, which we don't know when it's going to end. It keeps us on our toes. We have riots in France, which have spread to Europe. We have a looming climate crisis, which the climatism experts tell us is upon us. But these are the physical things, and there are others too. But the one that seems a little bit more disturbing at the moment is an ideological battle going on. And I'm referring to wokism here, particularly as it relates to gender identity and very young children. So to give you a couple of examples of what's happening, I'm sure some viewers may know already, but just in case some don't. In California, there's a bill called the AB, I think it's 957. This bill says that if you have very young children, the age of 7, maybe, they have the right to express their own gender ideology or choose whichever gender they identify with the most. And if parents don't affirm their 7-year-old's choice, the child can be taken away from them. And what does it mean to affirm? Well, they expect that the child should be put into a program of care, which probably means some sort of drugs, puberty blockers, maybe even gender operations. And the parents have absolutely no choice in this. If they want to protest or they don't like what's being taught to their children, they go out and march. They get put on some kind of a hate list, and because they're extremists and anti-government. And then in the UK, we just had a recent case where a 13-year-old girl said she identified as a cat. And then two of her friends said, no, mate, you're a girl, you're not a cat. And the teacher got involved and really told the two girls off and said, they were despicable and they should think about what they've said and maybe they should change schools. So it all seems a little bit bizarre. Abhijit ji, what are your thoughts? Do you think that it's gone too far? Has wokism crossed a red line?
Well, it's a historical line. I don't know if it's a red line, but you look at every society that collapsed in the past. You see this kind of glorification of sexuality and gender and etc. etc. You look at Rome in its declining days. It was all about orgies and sex and hedonism and pleasure and all of that, right? This is what happens to empires or systems coming to an end, because they've somehow reached a certain plateau where there is, there's no room for societal movement. And the only way you can manufacture some kind of a political anger is through finding non-issues or much more dangerously exploiting things that had better not be, I won't say discussed, but certainly not things that you can just throw out in the public out there. There is such a thing as, having certain discussions in private and certain discussions in public. But it's very natural. We kind of knew this was, well, we couldn't predict how mad it was getting. But the more and more society turned from manufacturing towards services, we knew what the services industry wanted was consumers of services, not producers of services, consumers of services. And in that sense, rage or outrage has become the biggest product to sell today. So you find that, a lot of this is actually being pushed by the tech companies in Palo Alto. It's being pushed by an entire set of jobless people who need to validate their lack of expertise, their lack of training, and pass it off as something intelligent or important. Uh, it's fantastic for actual tech companies that do manufacturing, not just services, because what happens is it boosts the sales of their products, because in order to access those services, you first have to have the tech in hand. And what you're seeing essentially is this sort of singularity where way too many interests are incentivized into celebrating and propagating serious mental health issues as uh, normal somehow. This is not normal. Let me give you a simple example. I'm gay. When I was a kid, I didn't understand what being gay was, and so I used to cross dress. I mean, I still do every now and then, because who doesn't like a good drag show, a good clean drag show? But I used to literally think of myself as a girl and wear all of that. It wasn't an issue at home, but it certainly wasn't celebrated at home. Like there was this thing: you do it, fine, you do it at home, but then when we're going out to a party and things like that, at least dress up like a good little kid and whatever. So even till a few years back, the American Medical Association's definition of a mental illness, uh, you could have any fetish you wanted: bondage, sadomasochism, extreme sadomasochism, whatever, as long as it didn't spill out into work. The moment it started affecting work, it got classified as a mental disease. Okay, growing up, it was perfectly fine doing whatever you wanted to do at home, just don't do it on the outside. And it wasn't because it was shameful or anything. It was just that, why do you want to draw attention to yourself? Why can't you just fit in? Like, it reduces the number of opportunities for you. Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad, but I'll tell you what, it certainly helped me in a lot of ways. Because as I grew older, I realized I absolutely was not a woman. I would not be comfortable being a woman. I'm very comfortable being a man who likes men. Right. The one thing that nobody wants to talk about in all of this, in the gender affirmation part, is how homophobic it actually is. It is a genocide of gay men and lesbian women, because you are not allowed to be a man and like men, or be a woman and like women. You essentially, the confusion that you have as a kid is exploited, it is weaponized, and it's weaponized into a state institution to be wielded against your family. Essentially, the USA has become the USSR, and the UK has become the USSR as well, except the UK has, well, a king. Uh, a, instead of a czar, they have a commissar now.
That's very interesting, because if this was, if today's ideology was applied to you, you would have probably undergone some kind of operation by now, and there's no
Yes,
coming back.
there was absolutely no coming back from that, because
Mm.
remember, you will have the physicality of a female genital, but none of the functionality or the functions of pleasure that accrue to. And female sexuality and male sexuality are very important to males and females, to feel that sense of fulfillment and love, or even just plain lust, is a very important human instinct. So this has gone beyond for me mentally. This is now, why borderline? It's gone past criminality into sickening genital mutilation. Let's call it what it is. It's child genital mutilation. There's no difference between some Bedouin somewhere in Africa sitting and chopping off women's clitorises and vaginas because they should feel pleasure, to what is now being rationalized as gender affirming care.
Yeah, it's the mind boggles. I mean,
Or the making of eunuchs in Rome.
right, right. it seems very strange, because if I think to the olden days when I was growing up, we had gays and lesbians, and all they wanted was equality, acknowledgement, and fair opportunities, and then they just wanted to be left alone to get on with their lives. Whereas now it seems to have taken on quite an aggressive stance, this whole LGBTQ plus movement. And it's almost like if you don't agree with their ideology, then there's a problem with you. And it
Very
can take a very
interesting.
sinister turn.
They literally go around like little Hitler Youth brigades or Red Guard brigades, where you're required to recite from Mao Zedong's Red Book, or you'll be thrown off the roof or whatever. Essentially, what they are, and let's be clear, LGBT all have different sets of problems. There is no single problem common to them all. With gay people, it's a different set of problem. With lesbians, it is a question of women's emancipation, which becomes a lot easier with industrialization, where the only real difference between men and women is men are capable of greater physical work. Otherwise, women are just as smart in everything, and that mechanization and industrialization remove that gap. Women have a slightly different issue, compounded with the issue of women's representation. Bisexuals, it's a question mark. There's open discrimination against them even in the LGBTQ community. Trans people are the worst of the lot because they have the worst kind of horrific discrimination against them. Sold off to beggars when they are kids, genitally mutilated, God knows what not happens to them. Uh, they are the really disprivileged community in all of this. And to combine all these issues into one under that sick notion of intersectionality is the worst possible thing you could do. And look, we all knew this was being weaponized. We could see it being weaponized. It's been politically weaponized. Basically, we've gone back to the Dark Ages. In the Dark Ages, you had church dogma. Anybody opposed it, off to the fire you go, out of the fray, you're burnt alive unless you recant. How different is what we're doing today? In the UK, you can actually get jailed for saying certain things. You saw that unfair dismissal case in the UK where the lady was convicted of transphobia for insisting that men and women are separate, and the tribunal upheld her sacking from her job. With the right to freedom is the right to offend. If you do not have the right to offend, then you have no right to freedom of expression. Full stop. It's that simple.
Panditji, I mean, what Abhijit's saying makes a lot of sense. So what's your take on this? I mean, what is driving all of this? Are we really in a situation of civilizational decline in the West? Is that what's happening?
I think it actually is a continuation of a process that's been going on for a long period of time. I don't think this is a new strategy that's being unleashed. I think it's part of a long-term strategy. It's a conclusion of philosophies that were set in motion a long time ago. And the tragedy is that this is not something new. These philosophies and ideologies have been deployed and trotted out in various societies in various times in history, and they always have the same conclusion. And the conclusion is a dramatic increase in individual suffering and a dramatic increase in collective suffering. It's literally like taking a Ferrari which is functioning so beautifully and giving it to a person who is a bicycle puncture repair person, and allowing that person to try and make it function like a bicycle does, but they have no vision of something more refined, something more subtle, something which requires less hands-on interference, but perhaps appreciation and just the occasional tiny nudge if and when necessary or requested. And Abhijit made a closing point there about the freedom to risk offending somebody. And I think it's like a compass pointer for us, because it's a power struggle that has moved into the space of giving and taking offense, right? And the capacity to give offense and to risk giving offense should absolutely be protected, because that's how we get to know each other, and that's how we refine knowledge and churn understanding to get better and better. Understanding, revelations, visions, intuition, all of that sort of stuff comes from a churning. And you can't churn without risking causing some upheaval. The issue, though, is when shall we say, the freedom to take offense becomes completely unrestrained. You know, you'll see a 4-year-old child on the floor in a supermarket next to an aisle, thrashing away with legs and shaking heads and screaming, and a mum somewhere sitting there thinking, "Oh my God, what am I going to do in public? This child is embarrassing me." It's a power play, isn't it? And the power play is that if my choice is not respected, then I'm going to take offense. And that's nothing other than power. I'll give an example that sometimes I think should be taught. Well, I remember when I was much younger and we were studying for a technical drawing exam. I loved drafting schemas and plans and stuff. And the day of the examination, I arrived in the drafting hall with all the papers and everything laid out, and I thought I'd just go and wash my hands to get rid of any smudging marks that might cause the paper to become unclean. And whilst I was washing my hands, the teacher, Mr. Eggleton, and it's a shout out to him if he's still out there, he was such a lovely, lovely man. He leaned over my shoulder and he said, "You know, Satish, you can put as much soap as you want, but that won't come off." Right? And it was a reference, obviously, to the fact that I have pigmentation in my hands. But he said it, and it broke the tension of being stressed out about an exam. You know, at that time in history, it was a joke that you could make with somebody, and they could rely on the fact that you had a supportive, loving friendship, and you could actually risk offending each other. When he said it, I thought it was quite funny. And you know, it obviously didn't harm any of my sort of performance. I got excellent results in that exam, and I remember him with a great deal of fondness. And in today's age and day and sort of time that we're in, somebody could use that sort of a friendly remark and destroy that person's career. And it's nothing other than abusive power. So this is about power. It's not about justice. It's not about reason. It's not about friendship. It's not about what's good for society. It's purely about power. And that's something that I think needs to be looked at. I call people who do this tantrumites. You know, it's almost like we have a curse of a plague of tantrumites everywhere. And I think Peter Hitchens came out with an incredible statement. He said that we have a plague of emotional hemophiliacs, that their emotions are bruised with the slightest little bit of emotional contact. And this is a psychosis. This is not a reasonable way of existing in the world. It's not a way in which one's own personal sense of fulfillment will be enhanced. It's not a way in which you can achieve that satisfaction of having done incredible things in your own life and with other people. It is purely a how do I grab power by leveraging this capacity to be offended. And so that's a fundamental thing. But there's one other aspect of this, is that we are a wisdom tradition. And wisdom traditions allow a person to move from one understanding to another understanding to a better understanding. And by better, again, I come back to this notion of a diminution in suffering, individual and collective. You know, that's what wisdom is. And people amassed wisdom and then shrined it into laws. Over a period of time, human democracies and human societies, we develop a framework of rules. And those rules are based on collective wisdom gathered over generations. Now that's of incredible value. You know, that is the knowledge base of humanity. It's the inheritance of existing here for a long period of time. The contrary position is that you abandon wisdom and you invest in an ideology which gives you power through the capacity to be offended. So the exclusion that is being achieved by this diversity and inclusion initiative, the greatest exclusion is the exclusion of wisdom, of human understanding, of the right to learn, the right to discard one set of ideas and move to a better set of ideas. And this is nothing other than an oppressive priesthood masquerading in every sphere of life. The priesthoods were notorious for doing this. Whether it was excommunication, whether it was castration, whether it was ostracization, it's exactly the same thing. We've got power. How do we cling on to it, no matter what happens? The trouble that we face in Eastern societies is that we still trying to make people wise. Okay, we think if we tell them and educate them and point out exactly the flaws in their arguments, they too will come to the table and sit and we can be nice friends together. But that doesn't notice the power play that's in play. I'm reminded by a remark that Shakuni made to Krishna Bhagwanji in the Mahabharata, where he said, I'm not interested in dharma. He said, I walk down the street and I want people to look at me and be impressed. Right? I want them to be impressed by my wealth, by my stature and everything else. So he didn't have the wherewithal or the sensitivity to appreciate a more subtle, refined way of understanding. And we are in a world which is producing more and more shakunis, cunning operators, desirous of power, and desirous of some degree of self-affirmation by diminishing others. It's almost become cultural. And we have to recognize this. This is our contribution. This is the contribution of all of the wisdom traditions, that we have to find a way of confining and containing this emotional adolescence, which has acquired sort of possession and ownership of a Gatling gun rather than just a tiny little pistol, and is going around wreaking havoc. The last point, which I think Abhijit touched on so sensitively, was this notion about gender and children. If you want to enslave a person, the best way of enslaving them is in a manner that they don't know. I think it was Goethe who said those who are the most enslaved are those who believe themselves to be free. Right? And what you can do that with children. Children, we have this idea of sanskar, don't we? That if you give children sanskar, those are the fundamental truths that you can give to a child that it will receive without scrutinizing them in that age group. Whatever you give to that child, it will receive it, if it's from a figure of authority or a figure with power or a figure which dominates. And when you are implanting into the subconscious of human beings a whole load of contradictory, conflicting feelings and words and thoughts, you have a child who has no basis in stability, no mental stability, no emotional stability. It's a child who's perpetually fragile. Even when they grow up into becoming a human being, there is that emotional fragility and a lack of confidence in their own reasoning faculty. Those two are what you need to instill in children at a young age to enslave the human being for the rest of their existence. And it's a tragedy that we're now seeing societies which are doing this in such a systematized manner. It's almost as though the society itself in the West has taken the authority of crippling. In Yoga Vidya, we have the notion that the Jivatma is a Hansa, a swan. And one of the wings is the wing of Vidya, and the other wing is Gyan, and one wing is the compassion, love. And so the two wings, the head and the heart, basically. If you cripple both of those, then the Jivatma, the swan, can never fly. It crawls along with its belly on the floor, suffering from one step to the next step. And this is what's being done to the human condition. Rather than that Jivatma flying on strong wings of wisdom and compassion and love and affection, it's become less than itself. And any creature in suffering is always seeking an end to that suffering. And boy, if you can convince them that you have just what's needed to diminish and maybe even end that suffering, then you have a slave. And I think this is happening on a scale that we've never seen before. Abhijit alluded to Palo Alto. I'm just down the road from Palo Alto. I spent a few days down in Palo Alto on my last trip only a month ago. And it's nuts. If anybody has seen The Truman Show, I felt I was walking along streets in The Truman Show. Even the trees look as though they are petrified to move a leaf out of place. Everything is so manicured and forced into a vision which somebody has had, and they have applied it onto a natural environment. It's pristine and it's clean and everything else, but my goodness, not even a tree would move a leaf out of place for fear, and that's how it felt. And I think what's come out of Silicon Valley is the capacity to project these psychoses across more people than ever before. The capacity to reach into hearts and minds all over the world and instill some sense of discomfort and suffering, put in the seeds of mental illness. And they are doing it with an efficiency which is ruthless. It's it does need to be dealt with, and I think those who are Sanatanis, who have had the benefit of dharmic samskar, right, we have to step up and stand on the strength of those sanskar and actually start to heal and reverse this mechanism. We only have a short period of time to do it in. I'm speaking with many members who are the younger generation, and I'm hearing them articulate words and say thoughts which they have sort of appropriated as their own, and yet you can hear that these have been seeded at some point in that child, and that child is articulating them. We have a lot of work to do in this space, and we'll do it. The Gita is the greatest guide. Even if you have the Narayani Sena on the battlefield across from you, and they've never been defeated, and all you need is a courageous Arjuna and guidance and an adherence to Dharma, and the blessings of the energies that have created the whole of the world. If you have those three, then everything else will collapse. In just one last thought has occurred to me. Ravan was one of his attributes, his siddhis, was that he was a master of illusion. He could weave illusions with words. And so he would create fantasies and people would completely fall for them. There are times when I feel that Ravan, when he was removed from Lanka, came to the West and has been weaving the most amazing fantasies and deluding people into understandings of the world which are not real at all. And people are falling into conflict as a result of those. So we have a challenge on our hands.
There's so much in what you've just said. I don't even know where to begin. There were lots of strands. I mean, firstly, your description of San Francisco and comparing it, the clinical way in which everything is manicured and perfect, but yet frightened to get out of its box. It's such a opposite, it's such an antithesis of the streets of Delhi, for example, Abhijit. Whereas I know whenever I've been, it's like it's a cacophony. There's just chaos everywhere, and yet people seem to be having fun. Whereas I think what you're describing, Panditji, is that it's all perfect, but nobody's having any fun. It's actually quite scary.
It's violence, Navitaji. I was looking and I felt that even the environment has been subjected to a horrific, psychotic level of violence. And I'm sure anybody who would come from the indigenous communities would feel that. It's that small person's desire to find worth in imposing upon the biggest canvas that they can possibly find. Enslave other people, empower yourself by disempowering others. And what can be greater for somebody like that than enslaving the whole of the planet? Enslaving cities. And it's tragic. It really is. I've been observing people driving. You've mentioned Delhi and places like this. I've been observing people driving here, and there is silence. You have these electric cars, right? They glide by. Everybody knows exactly what's expected of them. Nobody winds a window down to shout at each other and gesture anymore. It's just unbelievably silent, and it's scary. It's not ebullient. It's not radiant. It's not life with its infinite capacity to project itself into every moment. It's not. It's
Sounds
just
very sterile.
sanitized. It's sanitized and sterile. Sterile is a great word for it, especially since we're speaking of the processes of genderization.
Is it a surprise that it's all originating out of California, the beacon of the tech giants?
The ancient Romans had a saying which some part of it, I think, is often forgotten. Ex oriente lux, from the east comes light. Well, the other part of it is ex occidente lex, from the west comes law, right? And this is what we're seeing. We're seeing the West project dominating words, which is what law is, into the whole of the Earth space, and the light has to come from the east. We are recovering from the ravages of this colonization period, and we can't recover fast enough. Everybody needs for us to recover very, very fast. We've been given a window of opportunity, and it'll happen very quickly. I often say to people, this facade that looks so impenetrable, it's actually a tissue. It's a wall painted on tissue paper, and it looks so impenetrable that nobody will actually attack it. Right? The vision of it is so impressive and powerful. And yet when you do start to attack it, it crumbles, it dissipates, it just evaporates because it's not real. And no matter what you do, the beauty of being physical beings in a material world is that you can pretend reality is whatever you think it is, but you can't. I think it was Ayn Rand who said that you can ignore reality, but you can't ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. It comes back and bites you, and I think we have to build a case on that reality. We're in that place. We can do this, and we need to do this. And if we don't do it, I think we will lose too many young, bright souls who are incredibly intelligent, unbelievably capable, and that intelligence and wisdom that I'm seeing, or the potential for deep wisdom that I'm seeing among so many youngsters, it will result in the worst level of mental illness. With each generation and each incarnation in our tradition, we say that you accumulate wisdom until you get to a time in your journey where you have so much wisdom, so much understanding, that you're on the verge of becoming an enlightened rishi. But imagine if that rishi is never introduced to the ideas and understandings and visions that are necessary in that incarnation. I feel that this is what many of our young generation are like, incredibly powerful intellects, and yet being crippled and compromised and experiencing unbelievable suffering. A friend here in the US shared with me that only last year they had over 120,000 suicides amongst young adults. And this is the nation which is the land of the brave and the home of the free and the leading first world nation. It's a facade. It's a facade which is crumbling. And as it tumbles, I think we need to help dig away at its foundations and then step aside so that it doesn't collapse on top of us.
You mentioned the discarding of wisdom. Abhijit Ji, I have a question for you. There's an aspect of wokism that demands equity, equal outcomes at the expense of equality, which is fair opportunity. So the idea that there are these oppressed groups in society and decisions should be on quotas, not on merit or need. Now, there's some unintended consequences here because I heard that in New York, for example, where crime is rampant, the police are not prosecuting because that would upset the racial quotas of the criminals because they're overwhelmingly black. And then in California, if you commit a crime and you steal something that's below about $1,000 or $900, it's not even registered.
Yeah.
So it's like, it comes back to this. I guess my question is India, there's an elite section of Indian society that really aspires to the West. It looks to the West for cultural, food, societal moorings. And if it's going to emulate this sort of behavior or these kind of rules, should we be worried about Bharatiya society going forward?
No, look, I think we're reasonably well insulated from the West. The very fact that we didn't adopt English as the link language, surprise, surprise, has come to be our savior. The reality of the West is not the reality of India. India has a lot more subsistence level goals to achieve before we start thinking about the kind of rubbish that the West is thinking right now. There are some people in India, say in Bombay or Delhi, who try to bring it in here. But even the looniest of the left in Delhi and Bombay keep them at arm's distance, right? Because they realize that this is not a proposition that's going to sell in India. But a lot of this is driven by money because, see, this is grift. When you have a situation where you've provided equality of input, but you can never guarantee equality of output. I mean, when you have things like karmanyavadi karaste mafaleshu kadachana. What is that? You do your best, but don't expect the same outcome. I might have made the same level of investment as, say, Dhirubhai Ambani did when he was a young man, but that doesn't mean I'm going to get what Dhirubhai Ambani did, because there are so many variables out there which are, there's luck, there's the education of the guy you hire. Say you hired a crook as an accountant and he screwed you over. How is that a lack of privilege on your part? Okay, so there's all of this happening out there, and when you can't explain the variables, you get in these so-called humanities trained, allegedly trained grifters who call themselves diversity, equality, and inclusiveness consultants, who come in there and sell you their services, which is really no different than a placebo effect. Really, it's not even placebo. It's worse than a placebo, because they're telling you all kinds of crap, essentially emperor's new clothes kind of nonsense, which nobody wants to call out. But as long as you've ticked the box, you can say, I might not have achieved all of this, but hey, at least I ticked the box. I don't know, for those of you who know how the Indian examination system works in mathematics, in our board exams, there are step marks. You might get your entire equation wrong, but as long as you followed the steps, you could get as much as 8 out of 10 for a completely wrong answer. I passed my maths exam that way, so I'm nobody to complain about it. But look, this is a system that can be gamed, and that's what they're doing. The other aspect to this is, why are places like universities selling this so heavily? Because there is a whole set of fake degrees being offered under the name of the humanities these days. What happens is, with the sciences, if you sign up for a BSc or something like that, or even a traditional humanities course like anthropology or sociology or international relations, you're required to spend 40, $50,000 going to a place of study, doing primary research on your thesis, and coming back and talking about it. Or finding something new. It has to add to the existing body of knowledge, right? Have there been frauds? Of course. There was this lady who claimed she had gone to Tahiti and saw these sexually promiscuous things happen out there, which was complete hogwash. But because nobody else had been to Tahiti at that point of time, all of it sold as this kind of Fantasia Island kind of thing. But the scope of fraud out there is significantly less. Here, what happens is, for that same semester fees of $40,000 per semester, you're getting a Harvard degree, a Princeton degree, a Stanford or a Yale degree, for doing exactly nothing other than talking about your experiences. I mean, do I really want to know if you got slapped by your mom for not making chapatis perfectly round? Because I can tell you, I was made to make rice, and if I didn't get my rice right, my mom would spank me. She'd spank me good. But you know what? So what? But apparently, you're meant to write all of this down, and it's meant to be this melodramatic tale of child abuse, of how a 17-year-old kid got slapped by his mother, who was worried that he was going to go off to Australia and not know how to cook rice, and about how it was child abuse, and etc., etc., etc. And through my lived experiences, I want to sensitize all of you to the traumatic victimhood of getting slapped for not cooking rice. How do you justify $40,000 for this kind of drivel? Not 40,000 per year, 40,000 per semester. You have to create an ecosystem where you get employed, where you get jobs, where you get a very good salary commensurate with the money you're putting into this bogus so-called education. And this is what I said. We've reached a convergence, a singularity, where everybody is invested in propagating this grift. Especially the universities, because this is the highest return subject for them. Before, there was something called general studies in US universities, which was meant for sports persons. They were going to do very, very well in sports and earn lots of money. They needed an Ivy League tag. And general studies was kind of really learning a little bit about everything: knitting, sewing, soup making, a little bit of basic arithmetic, a little bit of basic algebra, etc., etc. And that was fine. But here you have a category that's, you're literally spending just $2,000 per semester on this person, and your return on investment on this person is the highest, and you have to justify that course. Uh, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a financial incentivization of grift. That's what it is. It's plain and simple financial incentivization of grift.
If I may,
Yeah,
Navita,
sure, go ahead.
as I'm here on a mission, I have a particular task. I was invited to speak at a conference, and having studied the parameters of what's really going on, Abhijit's word grift, I think it summarizes the whole escapade. What we have seen is, shall we say, a group of uninformed people who are compassionate, being convinced that there is a terrible crime being inflicted all around them, and that unless they respond to resolve that crime, then it's a denial of human rights. Their compassion has been triggered. Their desire to do good has been weaponized. And in classic divide and rule gameplay, you create a difference, you elevate one, denigrate the other, and make the two connected and say one's responsible for the other. That's the game plan. And it's been done by a group who have set up a commercial entity. It's not a not-for-profit. It is a for-profit company which is going around teaching people about this terrible scenario, which only exists as a figment of imagination in their own mind. And it's gotten to that point where the establishment, so many members of the political class bought it, that if they now identify it for what it really is, then they all look like complete idiots. So it is that emperor's clothing scenario. And it's developing into the space where it's going to grow and grow and grow until it becomes so uncomfortable, and then it'll pop. And everybody will be left with egg on their faces. And this is all in the name of caste legislation, caste equality, right? It's an incredible act of superb grift. It's so skillfully honed, so well constructed, and it's delivered with drama that is worthy of a Shakespearean stage. People turning up with crutches prior to an event, and then when they get the judgment in their favor, suddenly their crutches disappear. They're celebrating with everybody else. It's all being done, and because of its momentum, people are actually saying, "Oh yes, well we have to go along with it, otherwise we all look like complete blithering idiots." They don't realize that the way things are, the revelation always occurs. The truth will always be revealed. As Saint Augustine said, it doesn't need to be defended. It's a lion that needs to be unleashed. And so as people are unleashing the reality, suddenly the temperature is changing. And there's a conference being held here, and the theme of the conference was healing. It was, rifts have been caused by this extortion, this victimhood extortion exercise. And we have to put some sort of balm on those rifts and the friction and the disputes that have occurred. And so the whole theme was coming together to heal. And we noticed that the grifters have suddenly started to talk the language of let's heal, right? After having vilified, demeaned, and caused friction across all of California and in many other states, they're now talking about, well, let's come together and heal. It's that classic thing. Whoops, I might get rumbled here. So what do? A rearguard action. And let's try and move past the processes towards reconciliation. And it's just, as Abhijit has said, it's pure extortion. It's pure exploitation. And it's being done so skillfully using the universities, using the networks which exist to create and proliferate and to establish a self-referential mechanism whereby it looks as though it's genuine, authentic, and real, but really it has no substance behind it. And it'll be interesting to see how this moves forward to a point where it does collapse. I think it's on the verge of collapsing over the next, possibly within the next 12 to 16, 18 months. and then somebody will be left holding the bill for it all when the music stops. And as long as it's not our community, then it'll be good to see what justice manifests here in the US.
So you're talking about the Dissolving Caste Consciousness Conference. That's next weekend.
That's right.
Right? Okay.
That's right.
So whilst we're on the subject of caste, I was listening to Asra Nomani speak. She's an Indian Muslim journalist and author. And she said on the topic of caste, she said that there was a certain establishment of the Muslim population which has used race to create this concept of Islamophobia. And then they use that to hide or to shield some of the more extremist views. They're being funded by Soros type of organization. George Soros is backed organizations like Open Society Foundation. There are governments that are involved in this, like the government of Qatar and Turkey, potentially. And she was saying that the Hindus are now in the crosshairs of their agenda. So they've introduced, or they're highlighting the issue of caste, and it's being used to pit one group of Hindus against another group of Hindus. And what are your thoughts on that? Because, I know you described it as being another ideological weapon, and in the past you've talked about caste as being a weapon of mass destruction. Can you share how you arrived at that and just educate our audience as to what are the parallels and what could that mean going forward?
Well, let's approach it from the point of view of extortion and fraud. Simple criminality. Let's keep it nice and simple without getting lost in lots of academic hypotheses. So here, caste has been pushed forward on the basis of a report. It was produced by an organization, a for-profit organization called Equality Labs. A case started, and that case is now known as the Cisco case. And so the two things, the existence of a case and the existence of a report, were used to give credibility to the assertion that caste is endemic and it's rife. A reasonable person would assume that if the report was demonstrably undermined and found to be not worth the paper that it was printed on, everything would collapse because it's one of the foundations for the whole thesis. A judge refused to accept the report as evidence. He said, "No, I'm sorry, this is not evidence, right? This is a polemic. This is just a string of words, word soup thrown together, looky-feely and all that sort of stuff." I said, "I'm sorry, this is not evidence." So that disappeared. The case itself has floundered because that case was built on straw-manning an individual and then literally crucifying the individual for 3 years in the stocks, in the public gaze, dragging that straw man into court, and then trying to establish that it was guilty. So you create the straw man, and then you establish that it's guilty. But the evidence that's emerged established that the straw man was a complete fiction as well. So those are the two bits which have been the foundations for this whole exercise. The worrying thing is that having revealed report as being completely fraudulent and inadequate, and having had the case itself fall apart because the evidence was, again, absent, but there was such an element of collusion in what the Civil Rights Department did. They colluded with the plaintiff and concealed evidence, refused to look at evidence, they refused to deal with both parties equally, etc. And those factors, when you take them into account, it comes to a position where you think there is something institutionalized here. They are not looking at the evidence, and yet they're still pressing ahead with it. And that is the issue that I think really needs to be dealt with, because what's happened is hatred and contempt for the Hindus has become seeded to such a degree. The evidence and the reasons and the justifications that were given, they've all disappeared, but the flavor has stayed. I was speaking with one of the employees of Cisco, and she was describing a visit to a supplier's site where the supplier had said, "Oh, hang on, you're one of those casteist Hindus at Cisco where all these problems are." And yet, this is completely unjust. The old boundaries, we always rejected group guilt. that if a member of a particular group is guilty, the whole group is not guilty by association. It's a nonsense. It doesn't withstand legal scrutiny in principle. And yet that seems to be now accepted as pervasive, and it's part of this woke approach. The other thing is ancestral guilt, right? And suddenly you can become guilty, as this individual Sundar Iyer was, because of his ancestral name, Iyer. And they allege that sometime in history Ayers did unpleasant things, and therefore he is responsible. So ancestral guilt and group guilt have found new manifestations in this new woke world, where reason, facts don't matter. What you feel is more important, especially if it gives you power. Does it give you power? Yes, it becomes a reality. And these cannot survive. They cannot withstand the passage of time. There are still enough good people in most societies who will come together at the appropriate moment and recognize that this is a threat to everybody, not just themselves as individuals, but the system itself. When it targets a passive, tranquil minority, as it is doing here in the case of the Hindus, it suddenly starts to spark off red flags. And we're seeing this. With the conference, we have got some excellent participation from the African American community, and their experience as being the recipients of American justice over centuries and generations, it lends a certain, shall we say, credibility to their opinions. And they've stepped forward saying, no, the Hindu community must resist this because it's a principle that becomes a problem for all of us. Members of the Jewish community, another minority, are also stepping forward. So people are beginning to object to it, but the state itself seems to be doubling down. It's digging its heels in, and it's passing the most ridiculous clauses, stage by stage, committee stage by committee stage. And the most recent clauses that have been passed, if you read them, you can see legal principle A, out the window. Legal principle B, out the window. Legal principle C, out the window. There are no legal principles being honored and respected in the clause. And it's actually very worrying, because one thing they did is they removed the references to South Asia. It started off Journey as being targeting Hindus openly. And now that it's gotten to this stage, they've removed the references to South Asia, but what they've introduced impacts upon every American. So, for example, they alleged that Hindus are endogamous. Okay? And therefore, the way to break this casteist endogamy is to insist that they cannot determine how their group members choose partners. And we're seeing this is a nightmare in the Indian scenario, where the SC/ST Act is being used to infringe upon the right of the freedom of people to choose their own partners from their own communities and communities who they resonate with.
So you're saying you can't marry who you want?
Well, this particular clause says that if any community chooses its partners in a manner which excludes others, then the law can intervene, right? And they have used the caste notion to get this law onto the books, but it impacts upon everybody. So all of a sudden I'm thinking, right, so when the Jewish community say we prefer to marry with members of our own community, they would fall foul of this, right? When the immigrant community from anywhere, the Mexican community, socially and culturally, they resonate with each other, there are shared commonalities. If they choose to marry within those spaces, and they hold events, or they create institutions or establishments, shadi.coms and so on and so forth, each and every one of them becomes grist for this particular mill. And it's just passed through 11 voters, 9 all supported the amendment, 2 abstained. So that's an 11-0 decision against excluding this nonsense. And yet it's gone through. On the other hand, the Supreme Court has just rejected the notion of affirmative action in its entirety. So now we have truly a Samudra Manthan underway, and hopefully good will come of it. But the fact that it can happen, and especially to a community which assimilates and integrates, Dharmic people, we look at everything as our Karam Bhumi, and so we perform Karam wherever we go. What more could you possibly want? And yet the state institutionally has targeted them. And it's the impact on the individuals who are being targeted is very significant. But more worrisome is that America used to have some amazing statesmen. There used to be litigators who were towering intellects. You read some of the decisions that Supreme Court judges made, or some of the people who followed the founding fathers, their aspirations. They were statespeople. They were people of substance, not these tantrumites who put something together with no concept of principle and certainly no vision of consequence. It's, we've got to get it in because it sounds like a good idea and we'll pick up the pieces afterwards. No, as Abhijit said so eloquently, grifters.
It doesn't make any sense. So before we move on to the next topic, just on your conference, because I think it's important that the viewers know where it is, who are the speakers, in case they might be interested in attending. Like, who have you got signed up, and what are you looking to achieve from this conference?
So thank you for the shout out. Firstly, it's a new development in that it's a grassroots conference. A lot of people, simple people, understood the threat that this posed to their families, to their well-being, and to their children, and said we have to do something. And for whatever reasons, didn't feel comfortable in letting a variety of organizations try and do this, so they became engaged, and that's an incredible development. And I would give a shout out to every single member of our communities. Get engaged in some way, shape, or form. Democracy requires good people to be engaged in sufficient numbers. Otherwise, bad people engaged in even tiny numbers can hijack a whole democracy. So that's the first development, which is really wonderful. The second aspect is that the participants and the speakers are actually from across the spectrum. So we have Jeffrey Armstrong-ji, who is a regular on Citti Media, especially on Sunday evenings. He's flying in to participate. We have Mama D. Slade, who is the executive director of the African American community here in one of the counties. An amazing person. Deep connection to roots, connection to family, connection to history, and very experienced in civil rights. She's also coming up and joining us for a conversation. We have two surprise speakers who we can't announce, but they've agreed to speak, and they will be there in person. They have extensive experience of this issue, but also of the way in which the American legal system functions, so they should be there. Who else do we have? We have some participants coming in online. It's a hybrid event, so it's in person in Fremont, but it's also online. And so we have people who are participating and contributing remotely. We have the amazing Swami Ambikanandji from the United Kingdom. Again, another matriarch and an incredible, powerful woman in her own right, with experience of apartheid and challenging it as a white person under the days of apartheid and the whole civil rights movement there. So we've got a variety of speakers who are from diverse and suitably, shall we say, arm's length positions, so they can have a look at this whole scenario and see where issues are perhaps needing attention. There are 4 tracks. We've got, we're studying the harm that's been done in the education space, the harm that's being done in the community space, as well as in the legal and the political spaces. And so there'll be workshops and breakout sessions to try and get grassroots projects underway to deal with these issues. I'm here in California. It's quite a strange situation. The legislative body has just passed Caste and is saying Caste is not specific to the South Asians. It's not specific to Hindus especially. It's a phenomenon that appears in all societies. And yet the Department for Education, when it teaches religious education to children throughout the county, hundreds and hundreds of schools, they teach Hinduism and they teach caste. So, it's almost like a schizophrenic state, not sure about what to do. But one thing we do know is whatever they do, the end result is to harm the Hindu community. It's as though the choices are made with that as the outcome intended, and all in the name of diversity and inclusion. It's a very broad brush sort of a conference, and the intention is to give all of these areas an airing and to give the community an opportunity to speak. One thing I was horrified by was that when these Senate committee hearings are held, the Hindu community was getting no more than 2 minutes per person. And how much can you say in that time? And the evidence they were presenting was not being considered, not being accepted in any way, shape, or form. And so their voice wasn't being able to be expressed. And that's why they've gotten together to do this. And yes, I'm the recipient and very grateful recipient of an invitation to attend in person. And having walked this path to some degree when we suffered under the same problems in the United Kingdom, we've got a perspective which we can offer, a historical and a religious perspective, which I think will be interesting. There will be some revelations and some exposures. For example, wouldn't it be nice to know what Dunmozis, Varna, and all of those details are? I shan't tell you
She
what they are.
self-identifies,
Uh, yeah, she's welcome to. I remember visiting a mental institution once. I was teaching yoga abhyas to some medical practitioners, and as they were taking me through the halls, there was a gentleman standing with his face towards the wall, with his hand tucked into his shirt here. And I asked
Napoleon.
him, I said, "So what's his
Nelson.
story?" And he said, "Oh, he thinks he's Napoleon. He's completely convinced he's Napoleon." And in today's world, I think, well, there'd be people arguing and saying he shouldn't be in a sanatorium. What we should do is promote him into the political space, because all those poor people out there who identify as Napoleon, their voice is not being heard, and they have rights. So it's a conference which is going to, I think, churn the oceans a little bit more and hopefully accelerate the journey to justice and to better harmony between communities, and try and undo some of the harm that's been done, some of the very real harm that's been done. It's this weekend, it's on the 16th, it's in Fremont, and it's online. And I would give a shout out to your watchers if they would like to participate. The conference is called castcon.com.
Well, we'll include a link at the bottom of the video's description. If anybody's
Thank you.
interested, they can just click on it and it'll take them through to the registration form. So
Yeah.
that's one way of getting involved. And it sounds like you've started the process. I mean, something needs to be done, and this is a really great way of bringing people together to open up the conversation and actually educate them with some real facts and concepts, and not just arbitrary laws that don't seem to have any evidence behind them. So
It's a worrying development, Navita. You alluded to it gently in passing earlier, and that is that a group is now being fixed by other groups who have no vested interest in their well-being. And that's a problem. This bill, this senator, is being supported by the Indian American Muslim Council, I think IAMC or something like that. And they're waxing very lyrical about caste being a terrible phenomenon within the Hindu community. Whereas if you look at the letter of the amendment that's been passed, I would be perfectly entitled to put forward the proposition that when a Muslim person insists that Hindus are kufr, then what kufr is, you're creating a caste system, you're creating a hierarchy. The kufr becomes the untouchable, and the believer becomes the high caste. And so they too fall foul of this piece of legislation. And I'm sure that's an unintended consequence, but there we go. We shall see what emerges.
it'd come back to bite the proponents of this legislation.
Look, there's two ways of looking at this, right? One is this horrible person, well, not a horrible person, a very nice person who told me a very horrible thing, that this is Kali Yuga, there's nothing that can be done, Kali Yuga is dark, everything is dark, there's no point even trying. But remember, it is those of us who try during this dark period who we may not live to see the reward, but that doesn't matter. We have to do what is right for what comes after us. We may lose battle after battle after battle. Imagine if, after Prithviraj Chauhan's loss, if our people had given up, where would we be? Would we exist? There was no light at the end of the tunnel for 650, 700 years. And we survived. This thing has only been, 5, 6, 7 years now. It may last for another 500 years. We just can't give up. You resist. You always resist. So my only message while going away is resist. Don't repeat the mistakes you made. Mark Twain used to say history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. And what you're seeing is a rhyming where there's a lack of unity, where there's a lack of people within who are the biggest detractors trying to bring you down. And there's no point. India is a country that is so obsessed these days with its own history. What's the point of being obsessed with your history if you don't learn the right lessons from it? So, history is more than just dates. Learn the themes, learn what happened. Unfortunately, there's a lot of quack history going around as well. But, this is what Adi Shankaracharya, this is why Adi Shankaracharya wrote the Viveka Chudamani, the crown jewel of discrimination, the ability to differentiate between what is, in modern lingo, it's called your bullshit meter. So sharpen your bullshit meter and I mean, it used to be so elegant in those days. Viveka Chudamani then and then bullshit meter today. Modernize it. Don't pedestrianize it. Modernize it. So I leave there.
Thank you, Abhijit. Abhijit, it's amazing perspectives. Panditji, did you have any closing remarks?
Well, I'd add one extension to Abhijitji's remarks there, one little comment, and that is that as Hindus, as Sanatanis, we're coming back here. Abhijitji said, you may not see the results in your lifetime, but in fact, we may well come to see the results and the fruits of our actions, as well as the fruits of our inactions. And so the same guidance that Krishnaji gave is relevant, which is yata ichasi tata kuru, which means act, do something, whatever you can, at whatever level you can. Please engage with the issues, and then you yourself will become a bigger person in the Kurukshetra, and you will get the rewards for it. So everybody should really just step forward and do their best, cooperate, support each other, and let's contribute a dharmic perspective into the wider world. It needs us very, very badly.
Thank you. Namaste. Thank you to both of you. It's been a very interesting discussion. Thank you, Panditji. Thank you, Abhijitji.
Thanks for having me on, Navita.
All I have to say is Jai Shri Ram and stay safe till next time.
Jai Shri Ram ji. Jai Shri Ram. Pranam. Namaste.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.